Thanks for giving me the opportunity to share some of the data sets that we've actually made public over the last decade or so. Everything I'm talking about today, almost everything I'm talking about today, is in some form or another already up on somewhere where you can download it and start using it. And also, because this is, I think, a workshop rather than you might say, a seminar. So feel free to ask questions during the talk. If you have specific or general questions about any of the data that I'm introducing to you, potential applications, where to get it, potential problems, just go ahead and ask. We don't have to wait for the end. And in that case, we'll get going. So I want to put into context the data sets that I'm going to be introducing to you today. So with my collaborators, my team, I'll introduce my team in just a second. We have a sort of a family of data collection projects where we essentially locate data, typically in open source data, like facsimile reproductions of archival records and so forth, mostly from the 18th and 19th centuries and early 20th centuries. And we transcribe them into data sets, but with particular emphasis on materials like microdata on either demographic or family phenomenon, or more recently, a lot of our attention is focused on collecting I'd say tabular data or data material that can be transformed into tabular data on microdata on elites of various sorts, educational, political, and other elites. So the overall kind of family of data sets that I'll be talking about today, on the one hand, is the population. These colors are wrong, but we have two population data sets from Northeast China that we have previously already made public. They've been up at ICPSR, and I'll introduce those. We've kind of completed entry of those data sets about 10 or 15 years ago, and then we were actually very fortunate to get NIH funding to support their release. And then we also, when it comes to family and population, we have some other data sets that from the mid 20th century, but which are not really ready for public release because there's confidentiality issues and so forth. But one of them is I'll just mention quickly, and then if you're interested, we can come back to it. But it's not really public yet. But in 1968, in the run-up to the just before the Cultural Revolution, there was a movement called the Four Cleanups in China, the Siqing, and in preparation for this, at least in some provinces, they compiled sort of household forms, for every household that would have a household history going back to before 1949, that would include information that was relevant for assessing their family history in terms of their wealth and so forth, political status. So these are the Jiateng, Chengfen, Dengji Biao, and so that's one data set. We've got a few papers out. Another is that actually one of our former students, Matt Nollert, who was at Iowa and is now at Hitotsubashi, he actually managed to acquire some forms, sort of household forms, compiled in Heilongjiang in Northeast China in 1949 or so. At the time of the land reform took place in Northeast China, kind of before the rest of China. But in the run-up to the land reform, there were forms, rosters were compiled that listed essentially listed people and then were used to identify whether they were, quote, class enemies that needed to be struggled against, or land needed to be expropriated. And then actually these rosters also included kind of what happened to people during the land reform, that is, whether they were beaten to death, driven away, whether they fled, other punishments. And so he wrote a whole book that just came out last year called Power Over Property, which analyzes these. But and then we have some other kind of data from the first half of the 20th century, like we have student registration cards from universities in China. I think we have now probably registration cards for something like a third to a half of the students who matriculated at universities in China in the first half of the 20th century, because there just weren't that many universities, and a fair number of these cards are actually in open archives. There's a story behind that. We've also been collecting data on students who went overseas to study, that is overseas as in outside of China. Also, we've been collecting rosters of various kinds of people with professional credentials, like engineers, accountants, lawyers, anything that kind of generated a sort of systematic paper trail. And again, this is all kind of in progress, so I won't get into it too much. So what I'll be talking about, again, is mainly these population data here from the essentially the 18th and 19th centuries. And then I'm going to talk a lot about this data set, which I didn't talk about much on yesterday, which is records of civil officials, actually civil and military officials in the 19th century in the Qing dynasty. Yeah, so I guess we also have some rosters of government employees, officials after 1911, but we're sort of a long way from having those ready for release. Kind of want to shout out to our team. So we've accumulated a sort of fairly large team of people. We're working with these. So my longtime collaborator, James Lee, Liang Chen, who's at University, Chen Shuang is at Iowa, Dong Hao is at Peking, at Beida, Shui Qin, my former PhD student at Central China Normal University, Matt Nollert, former PhD student now at Hitatsubashi, Chen Bijia worked with me on the government employee data set, and she's working for a publisher in Beijing, Ren Yushui at Jiaotong University. And then we also have right now 6 current PhD students. Well, if I keep introducing people, I'll run out of time. But anyway, everyone's sort of played key roles in the accumulation of these different data sets. The other thing I want to make clear is that we didn't enter the data ourselves. We actually have had a stable team of people doing data entry for us. It's roughly the same group of people for probably 20 years or so. There's a long story about how we connected with all of them. This was actually a retirement dinner for one of our coders who had worked with us for, yeah, I think 15 or 20 years or so. And so we've been very fortunate that for all this data entry of millions and millions of records, that we've had this kind of very stable group of people working with us that kind of understand what we need and so forth. So the first data set I want to talk about is the, let's see, how do China multi-generational panel data set, which is I think a source for the study of family and population in China before the 20th century. And it's actually 2 different data sets, which together have about 3 million records of about 350,000 people over multiple generations. And I think the most distinctive feature of these data is that they follow families, at least they follow patrilines over time, especially the Liaoning data set. So there are some other historical data sets in Europe which are multi-generational, like some Swedish registered data sets and so forth. Those tend to be a little bit harder to work with. There's more migration, people move in and out, and so forth. These are closed populations. So exits from the region are actually rare. So you sort of, you can sort of follow people with some certainty that you're not sort of losing a lot of people to over generations to out migration and so forth. And they're all available at ICPSR. I'll put up the links later. So the first one is the CMGPD, China Multi-Generational Panel Dataset Liaoning, which has triennial population registers for 29 administrative populations in present-day Liaoning in northeast China between 1744 and 1909. And then Shuangcheng is annual population registers for 14 administrative populations in Shuangcheng County in Heilongjiang, not far from Harbin, between 1866 and 1910. And we've actually harmonized, for the public release, we harmonized all the variables across the two data sets. So you can essentially even have undergraduates, downloading these data and kind of, doing stuff with them in, sort of 15 minutes. The data is already sort of, ready to use. Both of these data sets, they have sort of three kinds of variables. One set of variables are identifiers, typically used to group records in some fashion or another. So they could be personal identifiers that group records of the same person in different registers. Registers are every 3 years or every year. So with that kind of a identifier, you can reconstruct people's life histories and so forth. There's household identifiers that kind of group members of the same household or group people in the same village, etc. And we have descriptive variables that measure characteristics of an individual or their household at a particular point in time. Some of these come from the raw data, some of them we constructed. And then we have event or transition variables, typically demographic events, that measure the occurrence of events between the current register and the next register. And some of those are from original sources, some of them constructed after linkage. So key variables actually available in both data sets include the ability to, group records of the same individual, records of the same household across both within a register and across different registers. We have patrilineage identifiers via linkage, village, administrative district, and then administrative population. Then we have these descriptive or contextual variables like age, relationship to the head of the household, marital status, people's official position or title, if they had one, a disability, that's a kind of maybe I can explain that, but it's actually one of the historical populations where there's any systematic recording of disability. The farmers, especially in the Liaoning, because they were on land that was owned by the state, they were potentially liable for providing corvée labor to the government, but they could be exempted from corvée labor if they had a registered disability. And so there's actually some registers where they actually specify people's disability in some detail by, of course, it's within the standards of the time. So it may, so you see records that are indicating that maybe somebody has a paralyzed leg, or they're half paralyzed, or they're mute or blind or something like that. So we have a manuscript that's been sitting around for years on this, but I sort of got busy with other things. But then there's in some periods, they don't list the specific disability. They just specify that somebody was exempted because of a disability from corvée. And then the whole system kind of collapsed after a few decades, because I guess everyone figured out how to kind of falsely claim some disability. And you see this sort of sudden increase in the share of men that were listed as disabled, and then suddenly they just stopped recording disability. So some things never change. But and then household, we have constructed variables for household and ancestor and kin characteristics. So things like counts of the numbers of living cousins that somebody has, counts of the number of siblings, counts of uncles, and so forth. Then we have these event variables like whether or not somebody dies in the next 3 years, whether or not they are marry, whether or not they remarry, whether or not they have a birth as registered, absconding. So I mentioned these populations were closed because these people were something like, you might say, tenants on state land, sort of like serfs. They paid rent in kind to the state, maybe like crown peasants in Eastern Europe, and they weren't supposed to leave without permission. So if somebody actually left the area, there would actually be an indication, saying this person sort of Chen Tao or something, or they had sort of left without permission and so forth. And then we have household divisions. So we've published. Oh yeah, Jason. Yeah. Oh yeah. Well, I'll get to the. Maybe I'll be showing some examples. So this is kind of the overview, but I can say very quickly before I get into more detail that what's really, I think, striking about these data compared to other pre-20th century Chinese data is that we have pretty complete recording of married women, including or previously married women like widows. So once a woman joins her husband's household, she's actually recorded until death. And there's actually no other pre-20th century Chinese source that records women in such detail. Like genealogies tend to be very sketchy about any details they record. Women may show up in genealogies as wives, but quite often it's nothing more than their surname, that to indicate that they were married to somebody in a genealogy. They don't have death dates, birth dates, etc. So we have this great recording of married women. The recording of daughters, that is unmarried women, is less complete, and it's actually, there's sort of a surprise as to, at some level, why daughters were recorded at all, given almost every other Chinese source that you could look at before the 20th century has no information at all about daughters. It's very rarely recorded in family genealogies, but because these were again state farmers on state land, and they had this kind of affiliation with the Qing state, girls, daughters actually were eligible for being recruited for service in the imperial palace as xiaoyu. I'm sorry, but yeah, that in the imperial palace, right? The forgot the term, but where the area where the empress and the concubines would live, the male, they didn't have male employees. It's not PERDA, but essentially they had to recruit all these women, as sort of housekeepers or servants and so forth. And so by virtue of their affiliation with the state, daughters from these families were in principle eligible to be recruited to Beijing to work in the palace. And so, as far as we know, the reason that daughters were recorded in the registers by some families was that it would help establish documentary evidence that they were actually qualified to serve in the palace that they had this affiliation. So does that handle? Then there'll be some more. Yeah. Yes. So we get it. And then we get an indicator of when they marry out. So there'll be there's a chu jia, that in the register after which they exit. So I can get into, I may know where you're going, but we've been experimenting with linkage between outmarrying daughters and in-marrying wives. It's 3 or 4 or 5 years ago, we experimented, weren't very happy with the results, but since then we've been doing linkage in other contexts, and I'd like to go back to this actually, and it wouldn't be you have complete records of wives, but incomplete records of daughters, but there should be enough to, do something, right? And anyway, we can come back to that. So, we published, I'm putting this up to try to convince you that there's still a lot of great things that can be done with these data that you could place in major journals. So we have either we or students have papers in, evolution, human behavior, demography, social science and medicine, ASR, demographic research. There's actually now, more recently, some people who have no connection with us at all have begun to publish using these data. I think one paper in Chinese Economic Review, I think one paper in Population Economics, and then there's at least one or two others just in the last year or so. So, there are people actually doing things and publishing in decent journals using these data. So what's special about population registers? I think for this audience, I probably don't have to explain too much detail because they're basically longitudinal data. So it's a lot like working with some kind of a historical analog to the NLSY, or maybe, like an NLSY, or if you work in, say, outside the US, the samples that are part of the in-depth network, the household registration samples. So you get household and community context, you get recording of demographic events, social and economic status, and then importantly, entrances and exits into the population. So you, at any particular point in time, it's because of the registration system, you have a pretty good idea of who the numerator is, like who's actually at risk of experiencing an event. So the registers combine features of things like parish registers, vital registers, genealogies, and censuses. They're sort of the best of all of these things in one source. So you get longitudinal, individual level, household and community context, geographic specificity, and the timing of vital events. So this is basically summarizing like sort of the characteristics of different data sets that are commonly used in historical demography. Yeah.
Can you say geographic specificity? How fine changes like the address?
Actually, some of the European, what I meant by geographic specificity is that you at least know that there's a particular target population defined by a kind of a, an area, and so you know, in our data, they didn't have addresses, but you would know at least the village in which they lived. And whereas, and then actually there's European registers that, they do have addresses like, and so forth. But, a lot of the other sources, if you think about, we all like data longitudinal, we like data that's individual level. We like data that aggregates folds. We like data that is, geographically specific, where in this sense, we would like to be even more specific, but at least we know like where, these people are. And so, we can link that to spatial context information. We have complete target populations, nearly complete. We know the population at risk because the entrances and exits are known. And then we know the timing of vital events. So these other sources only have kind of a few of each. So censuses, they're actually are great, but at least maybe I have to update this, but until recently, censuses were not longitudinal. Right now, of course, Steve and there's all sorts of linking projects where people are now linking, Leah Bustan, all sorts of people are linking censuses, but you're taking individuals across 10-year gaps, and it's probabilistic. So I think on average they're right, but we actually can be a lot more confident about our, the fact that we're longitudinal than, say, censuses and these other sources. So again, it's like working with a kind of historical analog to NLSY or something like that. So I think I some of the strengths, I think this kind of just recaps what I was just talking about. I won't go into too much detail. I think relative to other sources for China, it's important to note that these registers were compiled prospectively as part of the state. These people were on state land. The state wanted to keep track of who was on its land for all sorts of reasons. So it was maintaining these registers on an ongoing basis. So one of the problems with genealogies that are kind of popular as a source for Chinese historical demography is that they were always retrospective, with the exception of the imperial lineage, which had a whole office devoted to its upkeep. But most Chinese genealogies, if you've ever heard of them, they would only be updated once every generation, where somebody would say, oh, it's time to update the genealogy. And actually they would quite often, to get the genealogy updated, they would take up a collection and you wouldn't actually be recorded in the genealogy if you didn't ship in. And there's all these other kind of issues with genealogies. So I think the registers, they had, so there was sort of a bureaucracy devoted to maintaining them. This is the, for the Liaoning data, the distribution of the villages. And so about 95% of the population, we have a latitude and longitude of where their villages. And yeah, and we can link people across time. So, if we're looking at boys born in 1900, about 60% of them, 60, we can trace them back to a great grandfather, and then we can work outward to their patrilineal kin within that many degrees. So through that kind of generational linkage, we actually, for the Liaoning data, we were able to kind of group the 250,000 or so people into kind of about 1,000 patrilines defined by descent from a common ancestor who may have lived before the registers. We were able to infer that the people were all, had a common ancestor at some point in the past. Then there's, so you can look at like layers of an onion, or you can dive in, and there's 25,000 patrilines that you can define by descent from an actual individual recorded in the registers, like in the earliest available register in 1749. And then, you can sort of we aggregate those. We can tell sort of in these people in the very first register, even though we don't know the names of their parents or something, there's other information in the register that lets us infer that they're all actually related and have a common male ancestor. So that's how we can take these 250,000 people or so and divide them into about 1,000 groups where they in principle have a common male ancestor. Some limitations: boys are who die in early childhood tend not to be recorded, so you can't really do infant mortality. And you tend to underestimate fertility. If you're trying to estimate TFRs like we did yesterday, you have to make some adjustment based on an estimate of mortality. Daughters are more likely to be missing, although we still have more daughters than practically any other pre-20th century source. And then all of our SES measures are kind of based on occupations associated with the state service, government service. We don't, in the Liaoning data, we don't have you might say, we don't have sort of private occupations. So there's some missing, these are very technical, some missing registers, small number of unrecorded deaths where just people just go on and on from one register to the next without dying, but I won't get into that. I think this, I'm going to race through some of the more technical stuff and mention the contents. So I mentioned these actually already, the relationship, birth dates, etc. And I showed this example yesterday, but some of the kinds, some events and people. So this, for example, this woman, she's the wife of a household head. She's 42. This person is a household head who's 23. Oh, so this household head, yeah, this is his wife, and they have this actually a son named Xiao Xiaozi, which means little guy or something. One of the fun things about these data, which we've written a couple papers related to naming, but a lot of the especially the sons have these kind of but when the men are small, they just have these kind of colloquial names like Xiao Xiaozi, or I don't know if there's some others where or like Shaza, which means like kind of fool, or Gobuli means would be ignored by a dog, or some, or Xiaoheizi, things like, or Xiaodozi, like basically they're pockmarked or something. So it's almost like a nickname. They're written in as Xiaodozi. And then we have some events. So and then you can sort of, I mean, if you can read Chinese, you could compare these original pages and you'd see how people move in and out and so forth. So the Shuangcheng data actually is, I think, quite interesting if for studying like stratification inequality, because actually in one of our, as I mentioned, students, Chen Shuang wrote a book with it. But this is the unusual population I mentioned yesterday. It consisted of these sort of bannermen who had been living on state stipends in Beijing, and then were relocated by the state in the early 19th century to help open up farmland. That's what are referred to here as the metropolitan, or Jingxi. Jing meaning Beijing, or actually no, it would be Jingshi at that time, and then Xi for Xiren, rural, basically residents who had been recruited from Jilin or Liaoning to sort of show the city slickers the ropes. And then there was another population of Fuding, which were kind of people that had drifted in on their own and had started working land, and then they were kind of added to the system. So you have this kind of population that's stratified by kind of these categories, and there's a lot of interesting things to be looked at in terms of the implications of that kind of institutional stratification that actually Shuang looked at. So I think this gets really technical. I think the other thing that's quite interesting about the Shuangcheng data is that you actually have ethnic identification specified, at least for male, at least for household heads, that people are either specified as being Han, Manchu, small number of Mongol, and then there's one or two other very Shibodzu, I think, more obscure groups. And so we've done some studies of like assortative or ethnic intermarriage and so forth using these data. And so I think, yeah, this just some of the numbers and so forth. I don't think, actually the data is further organized by the under the banners, which this could turn into a Qing history class if I'm not careful, but the military organization, the conquest army that formed the Qing dynasty, they sort of had 8 banners, as they're called, plain yellow, bordered yellow, plain white, bordered white, that the Manchus and then the Mongols were organized into. And actually affiliation with these banners actually had some implications, especially with the plain yellow. So, and I showed these yesterday, so I won't go into too much detail. Again, the available information is pretty similar. The households tend to be smaller than in Liaoning, and the kinship networks are not as complex because it was a recently settled population. So you had these essentially atomized households showing up in the mid-19th century. So you didn't have much time for extinction processes to generate these sort of, you might say, very large kin groups the way, whereas in Liaoning, Liaoning had been settled for some time before the registers become available. So there had already been a lot of extinction. So in Liaoning, you can see a lot of villages where everyone has the same surname, right? Because the others in the same village have gone extinct. Shuangcheng, if you look at one of the villages, so everyone's a recent arrival. The surname distributions are much more diverse. So I think with these data, and I hope that you'll think about this, you don't actually, these data, you don't really need to know Chinese. The documentation's in English. These are basically demographic events that have a kind of fairly clear interpretation. So some of the people that have used them, they're not China specialists. They've just been exploiting the data because there's certain properties of the data that just are not available in other publicly available data. And so I think there's still work to be done in multi-generational sort of demographic and stratification processes, work to be done on spatial, because again, we have the coordinates of the villages. So there's a lot of opportunity for linkage to other kind of spatial data, like hydrology or things like that. Also, without getting into too much detail, there's a lot of variation in the administrative context of these populations. Actually, in Liaoning and in Shuangcheng, the administrative populations within which these people were kind of embedded had different, their affiliations with the state differed, which conferred different kinds of privileges and responsibilities on people and affected their social status. We haven't really dived into that. And there's still lots of work to be done for comparative studies. So are there any questions about the CMGPT at this point? Like you have ideas that you want to ask if they're even possible or if they've already been done, or questions about potential problems with the data or potential applications? Otherwise, I'll So the other source that actually we've been working on the last decade or so, we moved away from land population, and we've been collecting data, as I alluded to toward the beginning, on various kinds of elites. And I've been heavily involved in this effort to create a data set out of the personnel records of the Qing bureaucracy. So right now, I think this is up to date, we have entered 4.3 million records of about, actually we redid the linking, so now it's 5,000 officials. We cleaned up a lot and so forth, but about 230,000 officials who served between 1760 and 1912. So what happened during the Qing dynasty was that at some point the Ministry of Personnel began preparing a roster that was updated every 3 months of everyone that had a formal appointment with the state. It would be the equivalent of like having a list of everyone with a GS grade in the federal government. It'd be like having the OPM, Office of Personnel Management data, etc. But anyway, every 3 months they updated this list of everyone all the way down to county level officials who had a formal affiliation with the state. That was about 13 to 15,000 people. Even we're talking about a country that had a population that ranged from 150 million to 400 million by the end of the 19th century. But somehow the core, that was governing it was just at any given time just 13,000 people, which is quite remarkable. We also, these are civil officials, the equivalent of civil servants. In some periods, we also have military rosters, which have officers. The Chinese is Zhongshu Beilan and so forth. And so these data, they don't have officials that were acting in an acting capacity, people that had irregular appointments that weren't kind of, the equivalent of, like, you might say, contract workers, or adjuncts and so forth. And so for each of these officials, we have their name, province, and county of origin or qualification. that was the basis of their appointment, like an exam or a purchase degree, and then the location and the title of their post, like whether they were in the capital, in the central government, or out in one of the counties. And then we actually, I'll get to this later, we've been linking these data to auxiliary sources like exam records and so forth, and I'll come back to that in a bit. But so the yeah, this is one of the pages from the source, and a few of you might be able to read that, I'm not sure, so I won't go into it. But anyway, one of the people over the years were saying, why are you hiring people to enter this data? Why don't you just use OCR? But it just, if you look at how, like, a human being can read this pretty easily once they understand how, all of the context is implied by the formatting. And so, our coders, once they're experienced, they can look at this and they know exactly how to lay everything out in a spreadsheet. You dump this into some OCR thing. I mean, maybe you could train an AI or something like that to kind of parse it all, but you would probably spend as much money hiring people to go through the data that was produced by the OCR and the AI just to clean up the mess as it would to just enter the data directly. So we've had this team that's been actually manually entered all these 4.3 million records over like 10 years actually. So I mentioned the information that was available. So there's, you might say, two types of officials. Yeah. In principle, I'm going to have a little discussion of linkage to other sources. We've thought about it, and I think you could do that. Should work. The only issue is that when we created the Liaoning and the Shuangcheng data, we started that in the 1980s, and at that time, entry of Chinese characters was really difficult. So the names that we entered in those data are the Hanyu Pinyin, the Romanized names. So, like my name, Kang Wenlin, would just be Kangwenlin. Now, then starting in the 2000s, all the, the entry of Chinese characters kind of was standardized. Is that in the 90s, if you entered something in Chinese, there's a good chance you could get stranded because there were 5 or 6 different coding schemes and it was all kind of messy. So, yeah, I think you could do linkage based on the, actually, it's pretty easy to convert the Chinese characters in the CGED to Hanyu Pinyin representations. And then you could merge on that. It would probably, we thought about it, we just never got around to it. So if you, actually, I mean, that would be something for somebody to do. I'll mention that one of the distinctive features of the data set, which reflecting the kind of the, you might say, quirks of the Qing state, was that there was a clear distinction between officials that were sort of called bannermen, that is, affiliates of these 8 banners. The 8 banners were kind of membership in the 8 banners was kind of a hereditary status based on descent from somebody who had participated in the conquest army that formed the Qing in 1644. So you had this hereditary elite, the bannermen, who they only accounted for about 2% of the population of China, but they accounted for something like half of the highest officials because there was a whole system of privileges and reserved, there were quotas and so forth. And so, for those bannermen, we have their banner affiliation. And then if they were actually part of the imperial lineage, we have that's specified as well. So the other source we can link to is the lineage genealogy. Although it turns out linking Manchu names it's hard because Manchu names were actually transliterations of the original Manchu into Han Chinese characters, and they were not always consistent about which characters they used. So that's a whole. So it's much easier to link the non-banner. That is, I think, when I say non-banner, it's basically Han Chinese, but there might be some other people in there too, like Hui or things like that. So we have a very complete coverage of from 1830 to 1912. So there's a period from about 1830 to 1912 where we have an edition nearly every year. In many years, we have all of the editions, so we can really get at people's careers. Essentially, we can see them every 3 months and follow them for their careers. This is an example of the transcription process that, let's see, so oh yeah, this is a prince, right? Tides of Shaobao. Yeah. And so here's the original source. It gets transcribed here. Actually, these are all, yeah, this is their title, and so forth. And so our coders, they just crank through this stuff and transcribe. And just a quick example of some of the, with this data, we can do studies of the sort of, compositional studies of looking at the Qing state, which I don't think, the closest, Tom DePreet had a book back in the late 80s studying the American federal, civil service, but there's not too many countries where historically you can just actually just look at the composition of the entire, you might say, bureaucracy or the state to really understand kind of who ruled. And I think the key here is that if we go into the central government, which is the kind of the brown and the blue here, is that there's some, I won't get into all the technical details of why these bounce up and down, but something like half the employees of the central government at, you might say, the nerve center were actually bannermen, even though they accounted for 2% of the population of China. So you had you had essentially a conquest army and their descendants who accounted for just 2% of the population, but ruled the country for more than 250 years. And then if you outside the central government and looked at who was working, the prefecture and the counties, overwhelmingly it was non-banner, that is Han Chinese. So you had the core of the government was basically bannermen, but then the outside the central government, it was Han Chinese. You're going to say? Yeah. So there's actually we worked with some historians, and the original idea was that this was compiled as a reference for the emperor and his closest advisors, because this was this huge bureaucracy where there were memorials, and there's a sort of paper flowing into what's now Beijing from all over the country, and news or reports from spies and things like that. And so they needed a directory. There are 3,000 counties, something like 300 or 400 prefectures, etc. And they needed a sort of reference work where if they got some, they got some news that, maybe there was like a earthquake in some county, and then the emperor would want to, some of the emperors were quite, they micromanaged, like Yongzheng, and they would immediately want to know who's the magistrate of this county, and is this somebody that, I think is competent or somebody, and things like, so it was basically a reference for the cabinet. And there's some issues with the speed of the updates, because it looks like, especially when you looked at outlying regions, there might have been a 3-month gap. Like if somebody got sent to Yunnan and then died of malaria, right, and then got replaced by the provincial governor, the news about the update might take 3 months to get to Beijing. But it was basically to have a kind of by the standards of the time, it was an attempt at a real-time, roster, like the university website or something like that. There's actually pretty high turnover, and I'll give you a taste of that because we've done some linkage. And so, yeah, maybe I'll try to speed up. So another thing, again, a descriptive finding that's actually, but I think showcases just some of the unexpected things that come out of analyzing this is that if we look at Han Chinese officials and then the degrees that they held, exam or purchase, that that qualified them for appointment, you needed either an exam or a purchase degree to qualify to be appointed. Through actually, even at the beginning of the 19th century, something like 30% of officials held purchase degrees, and then that expanded to actually probably about 50% of officials by the end of the or the beginning of the 20th century. And it's even actually, when you get outside the central government, actually, if you looked at the county and prefectural administrations, they're actually overwhelmingly holders of purchase degrees. And so, I mean, this is important because if you've picked up any, especially papers written by the economists and political scientists who are doing this kind of long-term persistence studies, there's a whole sort of genre of papers, people talking about I don't know how the effects, like the examination system suppressed economic development in China, or this, these kind of, some of you may know who I'm talking about here, but, and they have these throwaway lines that just like, oh, because they're big on the idea that the government was a meritocracy. So they have these throwaway lines that, every official was appointed based on based on their performance on an examination. And it's just wrong. I mean, it's just flat out wrong, that half these officials, you have to take an exam even to get a purchase degree, but actually only a small fraction of officials actually had the highest degree, which actually everyone loves to talk the most about, the people with the highest degrees, the people that competed in the exam in the capital. There were about 300 of them every 3 years, but they actually accounted for a pretty tiny fraction of officials. And then there were a lot of juren. These are people that got a provincial degree, but then never passed. They got the provincial degree, went up to the capital to compete in the metropolitan exam and didn't pass. So they just went and became officials. So anyway, you get a very different picture of what the state looked like than you would get if you kind of looked at long-term persistence papers. And actually, there's a lot of ideologues that, really pushing the idea that the entire bureaucracy was all, meritocratic and, people, selected based on degrees and so forth. And you get a very different picture. The geographic origins of officials, that's pretty easy to do. It's pretty much, if you know much about China, it's pretty much what you would expect. So a lot of spatial inequality with even with quotas. There were sort of caps or quotas that by province. Basically, there was one sitting of the exam during the Ming Dynasty when they didn't have provincial quotas, and all of the people that passed the exam were from southern China. Nobody from northern China passed the exam. This was in the Ming Dynasty, and the emperor got really upset and sort of threw out the results of the exam. And then they imposed provincial quotas to limit the number of Southerners that would pass the exam and kind of favor Northerners. Anyway, but even with these caps, the places that were producing the most degree holders were actually places that even now they do quite well in terms of education. So Jiangsu, Zhejiang, parts of Hunan, this is like Guangzhou and so forth. So. And then this gets to what you were saying or asking about, Jason. This is I'm actually working on a paper right now on organizational demography. of the Qing state, but actually there was very high, this is just survival curves for how long people, oh, sorry, didn't, remained in office. And there's quite a lot of attrition just in the first year or two. And so this is another, I think, finding that surprises a lot of people, because in the absence of actual much data, people had this kind of notion that somehow if you passed the exam and you got appointed, it was sort of like a sinecure, or you know, but actually lots of people washed out in their first few years. We still don't know why or what's going on. Probably some people probably, I mean, I think even they have understood at the time that just because people did well on an exam or had great academic credentials, people who had great academic credentials weren't necessarily that good at actually running things. And you know, my analogy is that, you know, if academic credentials predicted administrative ability, universities would be a lot better run than they are, right? But so I think there's a fair number of people that probably washed out fairly quickly because it was apparent that, you know, you couldn't put them in charge of anything. Yeah. Oh yeah. No, one of the great things about the data is the nominative linkage is really easy. So we can follow people across the different posts. So these are, we're looking at exits from service, not from their current post. So these are, yeah, if they exit our data, that means they've left the government completely. But if they have a post within the government, we follow them. So we can study promotion. It was kind of an up or out system, so there wasn't too much demotion unless you got into trouble. So it tended to be, so we can sort of look at, you know, high flyers and things like that. Yeah. That's the big question, and so we can come back to that. Yeah, I was doing some estimates, and I assume that a certain number of people would have died if you just assume typical, you know, mortality rates for a, you know, high mortality population. But then there's maybe we can come back to that if we, I don't know, I finished at 2:15 or 2:30, 2:30 or okay. Oh, 3. So we go to 3:30 then. Okay. So if we have time, we can come back to that. But that's a big issue. This is just the career persistence by exam type. But I think so here's something, I know this will look like a mess to most of you, but there's something very interesting here, which is where you can really, again, you can use these data to essentially illustrate, I think, something that people suspected, but they couldn't prove, which is, so this yellow line here is the share. So this is high officials ranked 1 through 3. So these would be GS grade, you know, whatever. These are people, you know, very high ranked jobs. The yellow line is the share of people from Hunan. And so basically after 1850, you have this explosion of people from Hunan serving in the central government. I think everyone from China will know exactly why that is. So there was a famous official named Zhong Guofan who led the Hunan army, the Xiangjun, in the suppression of the Taiping Rebellion. And then he later became an extremely prominent official. And sort of all these people from Hunan kind of rode his coattails and ended up, there was sort of this Hunan faction that dominated the central government for several decades and then kind of slowly faded. Now somebody, I think Jiao Shui, or, you know, they got a whole, a QEG or QJE or something, showing that a lot of people rode Zhong Guofan's coattails, but here it is in a single slide in a presentation. But anyway, I'm almost done. So then I'll quickly mention some of the data that we're linking this to. The most important are what are referred to as Tongnian Shilu, which is essentially people who passed exams in the same sitting tended to think of themselves as classmates, and they would form cliques, and they would actually self-publish classmate directories or yearbooks to kind of help establish that they were all connected together. And these were extremely detailed. So they would have, like, say, the name of the person who got the degree, the year in which they obtained the degree, which degree it was. They would typically, maybe not in here, but other parts of the book, they would have their ranking on the exam. They would list their teachers. They would list their examiners. It's like an Oscar acceptance speech or something like that, where, and then they would actually, what we're doing right now, we have the basic information on father, grandfather, and great-grandfather. We've already entered that, but there's an enormous amount of extra detail on all these other members of their kin network that they listed. They would list their uncles and third cousins and even matrilineal kin. Maybe sometimes people list 100 or 200 different kin as part of their entry. So that's really complicated. So we've gone back to enter that. So we'll have these kin networks for the degree holders that we then link to the data. And we've got actually most of the qinshi in the 19th century. That's the holders of the highest degree. And then we have a lot of the holders of the provincial degree. So that's an example, but there's other sources we can link to that contribute other sorts of things. So we can look at age at entry into exit from service, age distributions. Actually, I'll just jump to them. This is some of the other information we're linking. We literally just finished entering something like, must be 40 or 50,000 resumes. Or when people had an audience with the emperor, they would prepare the equivalent of a bio sketch, like a 1 or 2 page quick summary of their career for the emperor. And a lot of those were archived. They've been published in facsimile editions. And we've been entering that. And that has all these, because that actually, this goes to this issue of promotion. People would actually write down, that they changed posts, but then they would also indicate like who recommended them for the new post, whether or not they bought the new post, etc. So some of the things we can do with this linked data, again, I think surprises a lot of people, is that we can follow people from when they got the exam to when they were appointed and see how many people actually got appointed if they had a degree. And what we find is that basically we take people who passed or earned the provincial degree, the Juren degree, and then look at the percent who either went on to attain a metropolitan degree or just got an appointment. And so if you were one of these provincial degree holders, if you didn't get one of the metropolitan degrees, you got into a queue for appointment. And actually, you could wait as long as 25 or 30 years for appointment. It was a pretty long queue, where if you only had one of these provincial degrees, and actually you could pay money to bump yourself up in the queue. The government harvested the revenues, and probably a lot of the people that were appointed early probably would have been from wealthier families. And then a small fraction of people, actually maybe about 15%, actually got the metropolitan degree. And of those people, almost everybody got an appointment. But I guess it's sort of depressing. You'd think like all these, even passing the Juren, earning the Juren degree was an enormous effort, right? Maybe there'd be 100, 200 people per province every 2 or 3 years. And you're talking about provinces with populations of 30 or 40 million, even at that time. So it was an intense competition just to get to the Juren degree. But, you could get this Juren degree that you'd worked so hard for, and then even after maybe 30 years, maybe only 40% of these people actually ended up with a government post. Now, in many cases, if you had a GRN degree, you could do other things. You could be a tutor, et cetera. But this is a surprise for a lot of people. We can also do age distributions. It turns out that the holders of the metropolitan degree, the Gene in government service, were actually younger than the holders of the provincial degree in service. And I think you're all demographers, so you can probably make the connection here that if you only got the GRN, this queue was so long and took so long to get an appointment that by the time you actually got appointed, you were probably a lot older than the guys that, and I can say guys because they were all males by design, but you know, they were all older than the holders of the metropolitan degree who essentially got appointed right away after getting the metropolitan degree. So actually, yeah, we can wrap up just some information about the public release. So for the CMGPD, that's all up at ICPSR. You can actually just search CMGPD ICPSR. You can some of you may have downloaded it. You probably download it, you know, right now if you want. And then the CGD, that's up at both at HKOST and the Harvard Dataverse. We made the 1850 to 1864 and 1900 and 1912 available for download. We just releasing the raw data without our constructed variables because we're still tweaking, and I don't want to be responsible if, you know, maybe I find some problem in my linkage 3 years from now and somebody's already published a paper using, you know, the linkage that I did, and, you know, it wouldn't. So if you want to do like record linkage, I'll happy to tell you how we did it, but for right now you have to do it yourself. So it's the data as transcribed, but we're also happy to make excerpts available if people come to us with a specific thing they want to work on. We'll consider a request, especially if people want to link to other data, like spatial data or something like that. So I think that's it. So we still have a few minutes for questions. Boyan, did you still have a question or?
Yeah, I asked about whether if they hold on.
Yeah. So that's probably a lot of them. So there was actually in the Qing Civil Service, there was actually a whole system of performance reviews. They had, you know, it's like, I don't know, it kind of get a sense of deja vu. So they had Kauhe, or, you know, there's sort of performance reviews every, I think, 3 years in principle, could be more often, where in fact they had, quote, KPIs that would be used and people would get fired. So like if you had an unsolved murder case in your county as a county magistrate, you could lose your job, or if you had too many unsolved murders. So what do you think happened? Well, they you know, the people figured out pretty quickly that they needed to reclassify, you know, what were obviously murders as either suicides, like, or they you know, there's a whole literature on people getting framed, you know, because, you know, the magistrates were under great pressure to clear these cases. So, you know, they would usually just pick some random person that happened to be wandering through town around the time of the crime and frame them, because they could extract a confession and clear the case. So, and so I think, you know, a lot of people were probably removed, but there's this whole other question, and we're talking to more traditional historians. There may also be a fair number of people that got a degree or served just so that they could say that they had held because actually, even as a former official, you had a lot of cachet and a lot of status. So there probably would have been, and we're trying to find evidence on this, but there were probably a certain number of people that were happy just, okay, 2 or 3 years and I'm out, and they would go back maybe to their hometown, and they would actually be a locally important person as a former official, because they would still have these, you know, networks of people that they had known their classmates and so forth. So, but it's really the biggest question we have right now. And the resumes that I talked about, they only go up to the time when people actually meet with the emperor. So obviously they don't have, so there are some diaries of officials now being published in facsimile form, like facsimile editions of like these really long diaries of officials, and that might give us some insight as to why people would leave service. But I think a lot of them were probably removed, some of them died, but probably some certain number of people probably just left. And because if you were from a nice place like Jiangsu and you like the food, and then if you got sent to, well, I guess if you're from Jiangsu, any other province is terrible, but but if you got sent to like I don't know, Gansu or something like that, you'd probably be unhappy and want to get back to Jiangsu pretty quickly. So but we still have maybe Jason or Boyan, yeah.
The government of that and they also
Yeah.
And another a traffic of going in China is that sometimes some photos that is that from the people with successful or the other the government is for the some people in the don't that and the government is better for country more so the biggest
that's because you have the names of the villages actually. Yeah, so I for some reason I think I saw at least a manuscript or somebody was doing this kind of tale thing where they were looking at if a high official was from certainly people have done this for contemporary China, right? There are studies that show that if I forgot for what era, but if you're a high official from a particular place, there's certainly these benefits get showered on that place. Now on social mobility, we're working on some, especially with the Tongyi and Shilu, because we have ancestry data. And what I can tell you right now is that one thing we're working on, and it was actually a paper I thought about presenting, is you get something like 50 to 60% of the people who are appointed have a father, grandfather, or great grandfather who held some kind of degree. So if you think about what a small share of the population held a degree, you're talking about odds ratios in the thousands, right? That somehow, there's only I don't know, a few hundred people, maybe a few thousand people appointed to office every year, and something like 60% of them have a father, grandfather, great grandfather with a degree, but the share of degree holders in the population is probably just no more than 1 or 2%, right? So you have this thing. So basically, the short answer is that as much as these rags to riches Horatio Alger stories are celebrated, they're actually extremely rare, just like they are in the United. People always talked about, oh, the U.S. is the land of mobility and so forth, but it's just, these are stories, and it turns out, there are the occasional people that just come out of nowhere, and that's great, but overwhelmingly the officialdom was dominated by people who, from certain families. So, yeah. So anyway, thanks very much for the opportunity to share, and I hope you'll download the data. And I think if you don't speak Chinese, you try the CMGPD, because you don't really need to know Chinese, but the CGED, that's probably a little bit tougher. You need to know more about the context and so forth.